Welcome to Unravelling the Middle East, where scholars answer questions about the seemingly incomprehensible and at times impossible region, this cradle of civilization. So, who are the peoples of the Middle East? What is it about them and their roots that we don't get? What lessons do they have for us and for themselves? The answers are told in scholarly accounts of the history, myths, and mysteries of the Middle East. Tales and takes you haven't heard before. And I'm Adel Ali, your host. In this two-part episode, how successful diplomacy worked in the ancient Middle East, and personal stories from 500,000 clay tablets, from acts of kindness to careers, to family tragedies, to beer parties. So please join me and my guest, Dr. Amanda Podany, as we unravel the Middle East. Dr. Podany, in this segment, I want to speak with you about the Middle East from the perspective of another book you've authored, which is titled Weavers, Scribes, and Kings, A New History of the Ancient Middle East. Um, I'm fascinated. First of all, I'm fascinated by how you and other scholars know so much about the Middle East. And in yesterday's conversation, you talked about tablets, clay tablets. And these are about sort of proclamations, codes, messages between kings. I get that. How do you know about ordinary people?
Well, the
We're
great thing
talking
about
about 4,000 years ago, you know?
yes, absolutely. The great thing about clay is it can last for a very long time in the earth. Papyrus, parchment, other things that people would write on in the ancient world, in other parts of the ancient world, tend to disintegrate, and the records don't survive. But with clay tablets, if a clay tablet has been baked in the sun, thrown on the floor, and ends up just lying there for 4,000 years, when you excavate it, it's still there and it's still readable. So there's an estimate of the between 500,000 and 1,000,000 of these clay tablets have been found. There's
Half a
certainly,
million?
yeah, at least 500,000. There may be as many as 1,000,000. They're not, nobody's ever actually managed to count them all. And these are just the ones that have been excavated. They're presumably countless more were written at the time. And because they wrote on clay, we have everything. We don't just have the things that the kings wrote to one another that were kept in an archive.
Yeah.
We have, if you dig up someone's house in some periods of this era, you find contracts for the purchase of the house. He hired a workman, so there's the hire of the workman. There may be his will, there may be his marriage contract. There's some time when he was taken to court and he has his court record. The owner of the house might have been called up for labor duty, and there's the list of other people he served with. There's just his personal archive, and it's just lying on the floor of his house. And that's true in so many places that we have, and those are sort of middle class people if you've got documents on the floor of your house. But also, even people who were illiterate, they come into documents that were put together, for example, by the palace. So if the palace is hiring weavers, and I love weavers, they're in the title of my book,
Yeah.
weaving women. So they've got a lot of weaving women working for them. They're paying rations to these weaving women. And so the scribes would draw up lists of all the weaving women by name, whether they had children, how much they were paid, which team they were working on, maybe how much grain they were receiving that week. And you can take these, and by looking at them in large numbers and tracing the names of people, you can follow someone's career. How she moved up in the woman named Zoom that I wrote about, that she started out as a member of a team of weaving women, and she became an overseer of the weaving women. And we see, how much she was paid. We can tell she didn't have children living at home at the time. That this is a woman who would have absolutely no idea that the future would remember her. It's like, I'm sure
Wow.
Zoom wasn't thinking, oh, 4,000 years from now, actually, in her case, 4,500 years from now or so, 4,300 years, people will be talking about me. Of course not. But we do, because those records survive. So
So
I
was
think,
was writing on these clay tablets easy? I sort of have this a silly image of someone, well, this clay tablet, they're not chiseling, but it's just you're not typing. I mean, how does this, was it easy
yeah,
to do this?
the scribes were incredible. If you see these tablets, they're so beautifully done. Most of them really, the cuneiform, which is done with a stylus, a small stylus, and a lot of the tablets are quite small. They could be held in your hand. And they would apparently write quite fast. They would go to scribal school and they would learn how to do it. And so in order to be able to, it was something unlike hieroglyphs where you have a whole little drawing to do,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
although at that point they used hieratic, which was also very fast. But they were able to make these little wedge signs, yeah, very quickly, so that it was something that was completely practical to use for keeping track of records. And
So did most of the writing, was it mostly done by scribes, or did people that were also literate but were not professionally scribes also write?
yeah, there were scribal schools, and most people who went to scribal schools became scribes for most
Yeah.
of the time, because it was a big investment of time to put your son through scribal school, or daughter. Occasionally daughters were literate too. And that means you've lost that person's economic contribution to the household.
Yeah.
And,
It's literally an investment.
It is an investment. So it tended to be sons of scribes, sons of priests, sons of people who were government officials who would get scribal training, and then they would be considered to be scribes if you'd gone through scribal training. On the other hand, there are some instances, for example, we know that some merchants were literate, that they got some schooling in order to be able to do the kind of record keeping that they would need when they were on a trading expedition, for example. But the vast majority of people probably certainly were illiterate.
Illiterate.
The vast majority of people didn't go to school.
What subject areas of life did you learn about in researching this book?
There were so many fabulously interesting things that I found. What I did was I obviously read a lot of what other people have already been writing about in my field, but they've been discovering things that haven't gotten out to the public, and such interesting things. So I'm certainly crediting a lot of my colleagues with this research. But for example, there's musicians, there's barbers, there are bricklayers, you can just about think of any profession and you can name a person in that profession and go in pursuit of what their life was like. Jewelers, washermen, weavers, lots of weavers. There's the scribes and the students at school. There are so many of these that what I ended up doing was, rather than writing a history as I had initially thought, just sort of overall history of the ancient Near East, the history is constructed of small biographies of people in these many different professions.
Oh, interesting.
So looking at their life, you kind of get a sense of what it was to be alive at that time. There are, I must say, a lot of kings in the book. So it's called Weavers, Scribes, and Kings, because it is also looking at the political history. It's not entirely a history from the ground up. It's a history looking at lives of people in many different professions, but including the big name kings. I'm not going to leave out Hammurabi or Sargon or Ashurnazirpal. Those kings are there too, but they too have a sort of mini biography, which then we then move on to people who work for them. So when I was looking at Hammurabi's interesting, but there's a soldier in his time whose life I was able to sort of reconstruct a little bit. And
well, tell us about that. What was that like?
Oh, it's so interesting. This soldier's name was Masham. We know about him because Hammurabi at one point allocated a field for Masham to use. And so that took me into the whole system of how soldiers were paid at the time. And there was a system called ilkum, so that rather than getting rations or something like that, the king would give each soldier a little plot of land. Not give it, he would let him use it. And it was his family could use it when he was on campaign. And for most of the year, the soldier was a farmer. He was farming his land and he was living off the produce of the land. But when he was called up for military service, he would leave his family on the farm and he would go off and serve the king. But he would maintain himself through this ilkum. And then you see that there were rules about the ilkum. He wasn't allowed to sell it. If he was taken hostage, if Masham was taken hostage when he was on campaign, there were rules about the fact that his wife was allowed to stay on the property, and his son would ideally, if he didn't come back from war, his son would take over his military service for him. There were all sorts of interesting things. And then also for Hammurabi, again, thinking about the ilkum, I then looked at the man who was responsible in one part of the country for giving out these ilkums, for determining which land went to which soldier. And this was a man named Shamash Hazir. And Shamash Hazir had this very difficult job of trying to figure out what land was available the king says, give Ilkums to these men. He's like, okay, well, I need to find the Ilkum land that's available. And we have his records, and we have letters from Hammurabi writing to him, and Hammurabi telling Shamash Hazir, there's a gardener, and he says that you've given his land to someone else. So could you check into this? Because I think it's actually his land. Check into, and he gives you the name of the gardener, and so Shamash Hazir is, running all over the country trying to figure out, is this gardener in fact has the right to the land, and therefore it couldn't be given to someone else. I mean, there's just so much. It's fascinating stuff. We get a little bit beneath the surface of the kings, and there's this whole world in which they were living, and the people working for them and working for themselves, and it's just so much fun.
Did you learn anything about I don't know, habits or personal crises of people at that time? Time management is a big thing in our time. I don't have time, or things that may resonate with us, modern Americans.
Habits. One of the fun sources to read are the letters that regular people wrote to one another. And so it wasn't just the kings who would write. If you had something that you needed to communicate to someone, you could hire a scribe and send a letter. And these letters are great fun because often people wrote them when they were kind of at their wits' end. And so you do get evidence of people who were, procrastinators. It's like a brother will write to his brother and say, I've been waiting for 3 days. You haven't shown up. Where are you? We were supposed to meet here and you're not here yet.
Not 3 hours, 3 days. I love it.
No, well, yes. I mean, 3 hours, you wouldn't get the letter in time.
Yeah.
And then someone else who would say, I'm expecting the oxen. You said you'd send the oxen. They haven't shown up. I need them for my harvest. Please send them now. So you can see the sort of the typical human failures of, I didn't get to it in time. But you can also see sometimes someone will send a note saying, and you can see they're smugglers. They'll say, the guards are strict and you need to kind of take that other route that you were going to take to reach me so that you don't have to pay the taxes.
And they're passing this in tablets.
Yeah, they're passing it in tablets to one another. And so there's a real humanity that comes through in the letters. And they often wrote when they were really anxious about something. And so you do get the tone of sort of things being rather an emergency.
Yeah. Did you learn anything about health, mental health, anything in that area?
Oh, there's a lot about health. Yeah. They did suffer from diseases, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, there's one example from the Kingdom of Mari where the king
was that also in Mesopotamia?
It was also in Mesopotamia. Well, it's in Syria, but yeah, okay. I think of Syria and Mesopotamia as kind of all Mesopotamia because the culture is shared, at least along the river, along the Euphrates. So this king Zimri-Lim in Mari wrote a letter to express his concern that one of his the women who worked in his household had gotten sick, and he actually says, "Let no one share her bed. Let no one share her cup." And he's aware. I mean, obviously they didn't know about germs, but they knew that these were ways that the disease was transmitted.
Oh, kind of like a quarantine of some sort.
Like a quarantine. And so he was sort of trying to quarantine her. And another woman who got sick, he was saying she needs to be in a different house. And then he worries. He says, but how are we going to find a house for her? So he was really trying to move her out so that she wouldn't infect other people. So they were very much aware of the problems of contact with someone causing that person to have disease, although they didn't know the actual means by which it happened. And they feared plagues, obviously. Plagues happened, and when they happened, this plague that killed a Hittite king that I mentioned before, Suppiluliuma, was a plague that was in the land of Hatti in what is now Turkey for 20 years. And there's a very sort of desperate letter from his son, who was king. Letters to the gods, and he's saying, gods, please take this plague away. What else can we do for you?
So if that's a letter, to whom is that letter delivered? They take it to the temple?
They would speak it to the gods.
I see.
Because the gods were in their statues, you would read this letter aloud to the god who's sitting right there in the temple, saying, please, what can we do? Everybody's dying.
Oh, that is fascinating.
We need you to take this plague away. So yeah, they were very aware of disease, but also they had famine. And one case, when you're talking about anecdotes, there's this tragic story of a family in the land of Amar. Amar was also on the Euphrates in Syria. This was later. This was late 13th, early 12th century BCE. And there's a set of legal contracts between a woman and a number of other people. And she had...
Women could enter into contracts.
Oh, yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
She was initially, in the first one with her husband had left, and she had 3 small children, and she was trying to survive. She was desperately poor. And so she entered into a contract with another woman who was going to buy her daughter. Now, at this point, the daughter is probably only about 2 years old. But the woman was going to buy her daughter. But instead of saying as a slave, it says to bring her up as a daughter. So it seems as though this initial arrangement was that she was going to get money for her child, but the child wouldn't be enslaved, that it was in a way almost a form of adoption that this woman...
Yeah.
But the woman didn't come through. The money didn't come through. And so the next contract we find, the woman still has all 3 children at home. She's had another baby. She now has 4 very small children. And the family, her husband's there, and they have decided they have to sell all 4 children into slavery. And it's just the most tragic example. This woman, Kue, we know her name, we know her children's names. And the most unbelievably sort of heartrending part of it is that the contract says, and their feet have been placed in the clay, pressed into the clay. And we have the clay footprints of these children, so that the children actually press their feet into clay as part of becoming slaves to another person. And we have their little tiny footprints. And the little footprints are engraved and sealed as though they were legal contracts with names of witnesses, who's seen this, who's taking them into his household. And I just, oh my gosh, the baby twins, they're actually probably a girl who was maybe 3 little twins. And then there was a baby who was so small that it said she was still at the breast, and therefore she didn't press her foot into clay yet, but she was sold into slavery as well. And just the tragedy of this family being so poor that they have no option in terms of being able to feed their children than to sell them. I mean, it's just...
That is both fascinating and extremely sad.
So sad. Yeah.
In the minute we have left of this segment, I'm just wondering, you're sharing names with us, Kuhei, and before you talked about a woman, I think her name was Zoom.
Uh-huh.
I understand that you and your colleagues read this language, Akkadian and cuneiform, written in cuneiform. How do you know how to pronounce it?
Oh, actually, that's really nice. I mean, that's a whole other story in terms of the decipherment, but we do know how to pronounce it because it's a Semitic language, and it shares a great deal with modern Semitic languages and older Semitic languages like Aramaic and Arabic and Hebrew. These are languages that also the script records the vowels. In some ancient languages, the vowels were not recorded, and so we're kind of guessing about where the vowels were. But cuneiform, each symbol is each sign is for a syllable, which includes a consonant and a vowel. Sometimes just a vowel, sometimes one consonant, one vowel, sometimes two consonants and a vowel. But we do know what it sounded like. I mean, we may have it slightly wrong, but we definitely know what it sounded like.
Oh,
I mean,
that's
amazing. If we
amazing.
could time travel, they'd probably laugh at how we pronounce it.
That's amazing. Let's take a break here. Stay with me and Dr. Podany as we get into the perspective. Dr. Podany, how do life stories of ancient Middle Easterners compare to our lives, the lives of us modern Americans?
In so many ways, they are so different. I mean, obviously, they don't have our technology. They don't have our speed of communication. They don't have our understanding of science. All of these things were in the future. So their lives were dramatically different. As we talked about yesterday, they have very different religious system. They have very different religious beliefs. And so in some ways, it seems, when they say the past is a foreign country, in some ways, it does feel very strange and foreign in terms of their how they lived, what they did. But I'm often struck by the similarities. If you think
similarities, okay.
Yes. I mean, we still live in houses. We still have streets outside our house. So did they. We still eat food that comes from the ground. We grow our crops, and we eat very much the same foods that they did. We still have dinner parties. They had dinner parties. We have friends. They're very sociable people. The ancient Middle Eastern cultures were all about getting together with people. You have images of the way they would share beer. Beer was their sort of drink of choice. They'd have a big pot of beer with straws, and everybody would sit around with a straw in this big beer jug, and they would drink beer and they would chat. You know, I mean, they were
Next time I hang out with my buddies, it's going to be very manly if we're going to drink beer with
from
straws.
straws. Yes, absolutely. But the straws were useful because there was a lot of sort of scum in the beer, and the straw got you past the scum. So I think they got married, they had kids, they had families, they cared about each other. They would, as I was saying with the letters they would write, the letters were just you can see how they were feeling. And it's not that strange. I think the shared humanity is the thing that is really striking when you look at their lives, that even though they have nothing like our experience in technology, and they don't work by the clock and all the things that we do, they were human beings, and they lived in a way that we recognize. And sometimes I think, and this is maybe off topic, but sometimes I think that far off in the future, always supposing human beings survive that long, 10,000 years from now, if you were looking at ancient history, I suspect ancient history will go up very close to our own age. You know, when people were still doing very much the same things. They had wheels on their vehicles. They had domesticated animals. They had, crops. They lived in houses. Who knows what's in the future? But we still have so many things that develop there. Systems of law, they had laws. They had law courts. They had diplomacy, like we talked about. Many, many aspects of their culture have come through to us today. So I think one can get sort of lost in the differences and then lose sight of the fact that there's a lot that we share.
Do you think there are any lessons from that time, from ordinary lives of people for us?
I think the lesson for me is the kindness and sympathy one sees in them, that, as I say, we haven't lost it, but it's there. And I think learning about these people and seeing their thoughtfulness. I mean, they really, there's so much about their culture in the ancient Middle East that is thoughtful and considerate, and one doesn't see, for example, random acts of violence are very uncommon in the texts. There's again, the sort of misconceptions we have. The idea that someone in a city would randomly attack someone else, probably it happened, but there's very little record of it.
There's no mass shooting back then, right?
No, actually, exactly. Yeah. That there was, and perhaps it was because they tended to live in communities within a city that were closely tied to one another. They knew their neighbors very well. They were the same people would live near one another for very, very long periods of time. And perhaps that's not attainable in a modern city. We couldn't go back to that. But it seems as though, although they suffered from many horrible things like disease that they couldn't deal with, and they did have more warfare than that affected individuals, perhaps more than it does today. And there were certainly things that were very tough about their lives. But they managed really well, and they had this desire for sort of stability and watching out for each other, which I think is admirable.
That's wonderful. Dr. Podany, thank you for educating me and our listeners. And to our listeners, if you know of any history that could unravel the Middle East, please share it with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.